Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. The global radicalization of the 1960s and 1970s gave birth to many new left currents and organizations. One of them was, to quote an article by the late Marko, which you can see in the show notes of this episode for a link, a radical movement of Ukrainian socialists and anarchists in Canada and northeastern USA. We were sons and daughters of the Ukrainian nationalist post-war emigration and the first generation to grow up in liberal democracies and to go to universities. We regarded ourselves as Ukrainian-Canadian citizens rather than as immigrants, but in the process of our radicalization, we developed a strong concern for the situation in Ukraine as well. Our generation was swept up in the late 1960s and early 1970s by the student movement, the protests against the war in Vietnam, the movements of African Americans and First Nations, the feminist movement, struggles for multicultural rights, and the Quebecois nationalist movement by the counterculture that defied traditional authority, conformity, and conservative social mores. So joining me on this episode of Victor's Children to discuss the Ukrainian-Canadian Anti-Stalinist left of that time are two of its participants. So could you introduce yourselves to listeners, please?
Sure. My name is Chrystia Chomiak. I was very active in the Ukrainian left in Toronto, and that was really the main center of the Ukrainian left in the 1970s. From 69 to, I think I would probably say, the early 80s. But 70s was the heyday. And everything that Marko wrote, all of those, all the movements, all the social movements for social justice were key in forming our worldview. For me, the women's movement was huge in developing my consciousness and my political activities, but also all the other movements. And we found ourselves working together in Toronto, going to university and working together, and being involved in the initially in the Ukrainian Students' Union. So that was my heyday of activism, really, in Toronto. It took different, more community-based activism when I moved to Edmonton, Alberta. I think that's enough of an introduction.
Yeah, and my name is John Paul Himka, and I was an American, but I moved to Canada in 1977. But even before that, I was in contact with the Canadian leftists and admired their work. But from 1977, when I came, to 1987, when we finished with our project, which was to publish a journal in Ukrainian called Dialog. I was heavily involved with that, and I subscribed to its major motto, which was socialism and democracy in an independent Ukraine. Okay.
Thanks. Could you just fill listeners in a bit about the politics of this current in general terms? What were the kind of the key ideas that distinguished these Ukrainian-Canadian anti-Stalinist leftists?
Okay, so what distinguished us was the social movements, the political movements in Canada. There were two main ones. In Quebec, which had the national movement as well, the Maoists were really, really strong, and they influenced a lot of the left in that province, or in the French speaking. Outside of Quebec, in the rest of what used to be called English Canada, the Trotskyists had a huge effect. And so that was socialist, but very much influenced by Trotskyist organizations. Another big influence was that this is the time of the Vietnam War, and we had a lot of conscientious objectors and draft dodgers come in. And they were also active and had an influence on the politics. But their politics was more anti-war rather than socialist. But the socialists in Toronto, and especially the revolutionary Marxist group, who a number of us were active in that organization, was attractive for a number of reasons. One, it was not Stalinist. Very important. So with our background and understanding, working with Stalinists would not be was a no. We couldn't do it, right? It just wasn't possible. And they were critical also of the Soviet Union, because they were Trotskyists. And so there was a lot of attraction there. For me personally, Trotsky, on his writings on art, had a big effect. I first started reading him at university in classes about art and art theory. And so that was attractive. Lastly, what was really attractive about the revolutionary Marxist group was that it was very large. The other groups tended to be very dogmatic. The revolutionary Marxist group, in hindsight, was also, but because they are much larger, and you had debate that took place in, I would say, a very principled, in a fairly principled way, and ideas were discussed that were not that the other Trotskyist groups wouldn't allow. Some of them looked like born again. They were like born again socialists in white shirts walking around telling you what how you should be acting, and we were very much part of this wave of trying all kinds of things. And so culturally, we were very open, and many of the other groups were very closed and dogmatic. So they weren't attractive. The revolutionary Marxist group was attractive. The Ukrainian-Stalinist organizations were not attractive, especially by the 60s, late 60s and 70s. They had become a shadow of their former self, and were very, very. They were unquestionably supportive of the Soviet Union, not just Soviet Ukraine. There were some dissidents among them, and we found common ground.
John Pulaski.
Yeah, John Pulaski, especially. I mean, for me, I met John Pulaski. If I'm going on, you can tell. I met John Pulaski. I'm from Edmonton. I returned to Edmonton. I was president of the Ukrainian Students Club on campus, and he put out his book, and we organized the Ukrainian Students Club at the University of Alberta. Organized speaking engagements for him, and it was a really interesting. He was such an interesting person because he grew up. Again, many of the people in the Ukrainian Stalinist organization, it was like second, third, and fourth generation of people, and so he grew up within the organization, and he was able to go to Ukraine because many in that organization were able to. And then he saw for himself, he stayed there for a longer time, saw for himself what was going on. And so he wrote
2 years in Soviet Ukraine.
Was that his first book?
Yes.
Okay. 2 years. Anyhow, he was very interesting. So did we have relations with those people who dissented? Yes. we found a common language. With the organization itself, no.
I should just mention for listeners who don't know this, so we're talking here about the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, which was the descendant of the older Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association. That was the name of the original group. So that is interesting. And I wanted to connect now to something that Marko Bojcun said in that article, describing the participants in the milieu that you're talking about as the children of Ukrainians who came to Canada after the Second World War. And that makes me wonder, were there also people whose families had been in North America for longer, or was it much more clearly people who were, the kids of folks who come over after the Second World War?
I think I was the only one in that group that was from the pre-1914 immigration.
Yeah, so it was the core of it. The core of it was children of post-World War II immigrants. Refugees, and who played different kind of roles within the Second World War. And so for us, the Ukrainian question was always a concern, maybe not the way our parents expressed it, but in the late 60s in Ukraine, there was a dissident movement as well. And reading some of the writings of the dissident movement had a big effect on us because we saw in them kindred spirits. They too were looking to, for greater liberty, equality, and we were also. And so we felt that we had a common language with them. And they also didn't use the old narrow nationalist views. Now, when I say they, of course, there were some that did, this is not to say that everybody had, but you had key leaders and just the way that they functioned and operated. We felt that they were that we had a common goals and common language.
And would I be right to think then that there was no one in the projects that you were involved with who was older and had been part of the earlier small Ukrainian-Canadian anti-Stalinist socialist left? Because I know, for example, there was a group of Trotskyists who published a paper in Toronto called Robotnichivisti, or Workers' News, in the 1930s.
Right. We as a group and also individual, we looked for people who were progressive, either in the nationalist camp or in the Ukrainian-Canadian community. And so, but we did not have any direct links with them. It wasn't did they come out to, there were conversations, that people would have, even with the Stalinist. They wanted to know who we were. The nationalists wanted to know who we were, right? So there were some conversations about, who are these people, because we had a very active profile.
So how did the current that you were part of organize itself? And I gather there was something called the Committees in Defense of Soviet Political Prisoners. I'm interested in the organizations.
Right. So the first organization is that we all found ourselves in the Ukrainian Student Union. We were at university and we were in the union, and there was and we gravitated to one another. We found each other, and we essentially took it over. So it came from from the Student Union, and then because you're students and you can only be in the union for so long, right? And also the Students Union is a students' union. So then we organized different organizations that to be able to continue to do political action. So the first that we organized was MITA. We organized MITA before or maybe around the same time. Actually, probably it was around the same time. The Committee in Defense of Soviet Political Prisoners, we organized because of the existence of dissidents in Ukraine but we wanted to look at it in a broader term. We saw the dissidents not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia. That it's part of a similar, if not the same, but a similar movement, and we wanted to defend them as a whole, not just Ukrainians. So how did we do that? We got together. We would have political conversations all the time, and we wanted to organize in a way to keep our organization going and to attract more people. So we created the Committee in Defense of Soviet Political Prisoners, and we had many campaigns. Toronto was just plastered with posters to the extent, what was that magazine?
Okay, I know what it is.
Yes.
Okay, so I was still in Michigan back then as a student, and I had a friend who used to get the Harvard Lampoon, which was the ancestor of the National Lampoon. And I cracked up when I read one of the articles which said they went to Toronto recently and they saw a cafe that said free Soviet political prisoners. And they asked, is that only with purchase? So they made some headlines.
Yeah, I mean, in the 70s, postering, producing publications and postering, that was how you communicated. And we would just, put them up all over Toronto. So we had a public presence that far exceeded our numbers. But yes, it was clear. Okay, I'm rattling on, so I'll let you ask the next question.
I'm just interested in other activities that you organized in.
Okay. So the
specific campaigns for prisoners.
Yeah, we organized the English language left-wing journal called Meta on what is the motto? Left-wing analysis of Ukraine and.
I have an issue.
You have an issue. Okay. Meta meaning goal. So that was the first one, because while we were children, so some within our group studied Ukrainian language and were very could easily write in Ukrainian, but the majority of us could not. Plus, our audience was English reading. So we produced the journal, and it was supposed to be a quarterly, and then it became, twice a year. But we had, and I was the manager. We had about 3,000 subscribers in North America. So we had it was big. For us, it was big. So we had, from the sale of, from the publication of Meta, we were able to, have a presence. So it was a really exciting newspaper. Or journal. We focused on different struggles in Eastern Europe, the Polish workers' strikes. Was one of the things that we really focused on. Cultural movements and people were of interest. So I'm sure we wrote on Czechoslovakia, on the Czech dissidents. So there was a lot. So it wasn't just Ukrainian. It was from that whole world, and it was left wing. Yeah. So that was another. And then there was a women's group, and Marko did not write about this. So the Committee in Defense of Ukrainian and Soviet women political prisoners. So we formed that group because. As there was a group of us of feminists, we felt that women political prisoners did not have the same profile that male political prisoners did. And interestingly enough, we had an awful lot of support. What did we do? We organized meetings and lectures. Really, it was public education, and we would get, 200 or 300 people coming to our lectures. So it was very well received. And for the Ukrainians, they'd always say, well, why can't you just have Ukrainian women political prisoners? Why do you have to add this other part to it? And we'd say, well, because it's that same world. They're all together. And we need to defend them, and we need to understand what is different for women, and what and how can we support them. So that was something that we also did. So defense committees and publications. And the other thing that we did is that we took part in the left in Toronto, both as individuals and as a group. And we would take part, for instance, in demonstrations as a contingent. We would go to public meetings. So that was also something that we did. And those meetings were not just quite strict politics. It was also a lot on cultural politics, on gay rights, on gay life, for instance, on various, on feminism that pushed borders, all kinds of borders. So it was very vibrant. It was a very vibrant time, and we definitely, both as individuals and as a group, did this. Now, it should be said that our group was large. Not everyone was a socialist, but everybody worked with socialists. So when we fell apart, some people quickly, lost that label and said they were not. But it was the dynamism of the actions, etc., that attracted a larger group. So yeah, they weren't all socialists, but the key organizers were.
And so with Mata, do you happen to remember what year it started and what year it ceased publication?
I would think we started 72, 73, and I think we finished probably like 82. It probably existed for about 10 years.
And then there was also the Ukrainian language publication, Dialog, right?
Correct. That came a bit later, again, because of the language, the question of language. And Dialog, our goal when establishing Dialog was to have an influence or a debate with dissidents in Ukraine. So it had to be in Ukrainian. But so that was the long-term goal. But the short, how we saw us going forward was that we were going to be publishing important historical documents, cultural and historical documents that would not be available to Ukrainians in the Soviet Union. So that's that's what we did. We published it in a format that could be smuggled into Ukraine. So we had a group of people that would go and develop contacts in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine so that we could take this material in. And we worked closely with the Fourth International on that, with some of their with people and the routes that they had to bring in material.
Can you say any more about how that underground work was done at this point?
I can, but John Paul, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was going to say more about the ideology, but I can say something about how the underground work was conducted. Is that, we did travel over there, and we made contacts with the Viennese Trotskyists, and they were very helpful to us. But we made the mistake in Czechoslovakia of working with somebody who was really an agent of the police, and that screwed some things up. And also for the Viennese Trotskyists, we had a whole van going in with our literature and their literature, and then it was stopped at the border, stripped all the panels, and then they found all the literature. So it didn't work so well. And how we supported ourselves, one of the ways we supported ourselves was we would go in, we'd smuggle the literature in, not just our literature, but other Ukrainian literature. And then we would buy books in the antiquarian bookstores and sell them in the West to raise money, because the price differential was so great between communist prices and Western prices. Yeah, so it was a two-way street on the smuggling. But I wanted to say a little bit about the ideology, and a little bit, which also shows my own personal take on it, which is that before I had come to Canada, I had been heavily involved in work to explain the strikes in Poland, which were occurring at that time. 1976 was the year of the Committee for the Defense of Workers, which was a Komitet Obrony Robotników, which was a time when finally the intellectual dissident movement in Poland, with people like Kuran and others, Kuran and the big guy and does Michnik. Kuran and Michnik were involved in many others, and they were in defense of the really brutalized workers who had been there. So already I came to Canada. I'd been working on that and reporting on it because I wrote in English, but I knew Poland quite well and Polish quite well. So when I came here in 77, that was the way I looked at things, that we would be the kind of intellectuals who would work with the workers, so that we weren't separate all the time, that the dissidents would work with the workers. And I would say all of us then, especially by 1980, when Solidarność and Solidarity appeared in Poland, which was a separate but related movement, all of us went to the view that in communism there would be a working class revolution. That's what we thought, and that's what we hoped for. And all of us felt that, and we were correct, that Ukraine was the kind of most important factor in the possibility of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And on that, we were absolutely right. We thought that with this workers' rebellion in Ukraine, which we thought was just going to happen at any moment, that we would then have an independent Ukraine. And of course, it would be socialist, it would be democratic, and that's what we believed, and that's what we hoped for. But then in 1988, 1987, 89, it looked like that without our help, the Soviet Union was on the way out, and that's when a lot of people really left the movement. They went. A lot of our group went to Ukraine. Or at least some fundamental figures, like our one of our chief editor was Bojcun He went to Ukraine and worked there, and another very important member was Helena Freeland, the mother of Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister here in Canada, and Chrystia's sister, Halia, who had quite a history of organizing feminism here in Edmonton, and running for the NDP, and running a left-wing bookstore. Well, she went to Ukraine too, so we lost her there. But I think that we overestimated the political consciousness of the working class in Ukraine, and that's really, really unfortunate that we were wrong, because as a result, the oligarchs took control of the country.
Yeah. You asked how did we develop these networks? Well, there were two ways that we did. The first is that we did rely on the Fourth International contacts in Europe, and they were. The other is that we looked at people who were dissidents, and so when the person that we initially contacted in Prague had been instrumental in bringing out Zuba's internationalism or Russification. He was instrumental in smuggling it out. He was sentenced, and he sat with Peter Uhl in prison. And it was through Peter Uhl's contacts with the left in Europe that was said, no, you should be working with this guy. Turned out that this guy was a police agent, had been turned in prison, right? And he continued that. So we looked around to see who is it that we felt we had common principles with, that we could work with. And that's how we developed our chains. The Czechs had a very developed system of bringing in literature from England, and other things into then Czechoslovakia. So we relied on their networks as well. But these networks were, of course, infiltrated a great deal. The police there were much cleverer than us, than we were.
We were kids, really.
We were. The fact that nobody got arrested is bonus.
Miraculous.
Yeah, miraculous.
Speaking of networks, what about beyond Toronto, within the Canadian state?
Yeah. Okay, so beyond Toronto, Toronto was the focus. A number of us came into Toronto. We weren't from Toronto, but that's where we focused. So we had committees in Edmonton, Winnipeg, Montreal, but small, because you had that tension between, we were very influenced by the Trotskyists, and they were, there's a lot of influence from the Maoists. So it wasn't quite the same. It wasn't quite the same there. But those were key groups. And as well, in the United States, there was a number of groups. So in 1971, there was also, we had a conference in New York. There was a committee in defense of Soviet, was it Soviet? I think Soviet and Ukrainian political prisoners, also in New York. And the students there put out a magazine, and it was called New Directions, an English language one.
Yeah, I wrote for that too.
Yes, yeah, you did. You wrote for that as well. So, and we had a conference. We got together, drank a lot, smoked a lot, and talked politics. and
smoked a lot. Back in those days, every time we had a meeting, the rooms were just filled with tobacco smoke.
And also marijuana afterwards. Or anyhow, so we were part of a cultural,
moment.
We had a different lifestyle, or we were, and everyone was. So that was very interesting. And then a couple years later, the American group came to Toronto. We had another conference with them to discuss. They were more liberal. They were liberal left, I would say. And they were not influenced. They did not find common language with any of the socialist groups, whereas we did. So that was a difference.
I'm interested if you could say a little more about the relationship between this current of Ukrainian Canadians on the one hand and the anti-Stalinist Marxist groups of the time. So you mentioned the Revolutionary Marxist group, which was a split from a group called the League for Socialist Action.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just curious about, so clearly not everybody in the current was Marxist. How many people were involved in the RMG or the LSA or in some other socialist group?
No one was involved with the LSA. We discussed as a group, where we were going to go, and a number of us joined the Revolutionary Marxist group. So how many? I think that
a dozen.
No, not that. Oh, yes, internationally, yes, because some of our members moved to England, to London, so we had a group there. About a dozen of us, yeah.
And then I guess I'm interested as well in if you could say a little bit more about how and why the current ceased to be active. You've touched on this, but if you could say a little more about how the wind left the sails, or
Okay, so the wind left the sails for a number of reasons. One is that people started getting develop their careers and get work in other places, so that the center was no longer a center, right? You had fewer and fewer people in Toronto, so that was one thing that that happened. And then the other thing that happened is that the left became smaller. Certain goals we felt had been reached. So, for instance, in the women's movement, certain there wasn't a transformation, but there was an there were a number of changes that were accepted by the state, right? And we felt some of the wind got taken out by just being successful and bringing about some change. And for some people that was enough, and so they left. And for others, myself, I remained, but I remained only for a short until the early 80s, because the left got smaller and smaller and more sectarian and more sectarian. So when the Revolutionary Marxist group was large, it was really exciting and interesting. And you heard what I really liked is that you heard different points of view, and the way that was all developed. And you so not only you heard them, but people weren't shunned for having different points of view. And then later on, it became smaller and smaller, and you no longer had that. So you didn't want to be part of this. I mean, really a very tiny group that became more and more dogmatic. So that is why I left, is that it both the size and then the people that remained were just true believers. And that was, to me, the true belief. And for others, being a true believer wasn't what was attractive. It was the social movement, being part of that social movement, and actually being able to be part of it and voice different opinions and hear and learn a lot. So that ceased to be the case.
So did you and others who had been in the RMG, you were still, like, you were active through the fusion that produced the Revolutionary Workers' League, and then the fragmentation that happened from 78 on?
Yeah. So that you can say that was a kiss of death, right? So it's and then you also had a shift to, quote, the working class. So essentially in Toronto, it was intellectuals, children of middle class families who were in the Revolutionary Marxist group. It wasn't working class people. Very, very few and far between. And so, lots of teachers. I mean, it was not a working class group. And so, I mean, working class in the traditional sense of there was a push toward, of leaving, quote, your professional life and joining the working class.
Industrialization.
And again, that was too much for a lot of people. Certainly for me, I didn't agree with that, and I was not going to do that. That was not for me, and so therefore I moved away from the organization.
And it proved a dead end, really.
Yes, it was a dead end. It was a dead end. So you have some very nice, very interesting, good went in and were not able to contribute the way that they had contributed before. Yeah. And so that was that.
Is there anything that we haven't touched on about this unique Ukrainian-Canadian left experience that you'd like to add?
I think that you pretty well asked all the questions. What I just to characterize it, it was we were socialists, we were progressives, and we were culturally trying new ways of being together, and so that made it a very dynamic group, even though we were small. So after kind of the Committee in Defense of Socio-Political Prisoners disbanded. I mean, disbanded in part also because more and more dissidents, we would bring dissidents over, and some of them proved to be really reactionary. Some were wonderful, like Plush, Leonid Plush, we were one with Leonid Plush. But then we had General Grigorenko came, and he was a general, he was a military man, and he thought that we were silly people, that we were, and he essentially said as much. I mean, he gave a good talk, but he said, you guys are not going. He was correct. He said, you guys are not going to last. You're just a passing phase, which is, he, as I say, he was a general, and he saw the writing on the wall when he met, who are these people that are defending me and sending me across the country to speak about the Soviet Union and its demise. Meeting different dissidents and actually having close conversations with them also led us to see our limitations and what we couldn't do. But just to say, the influence of what I call the Ukrainian left afterwards in the 1980s and into the 90s in Edmonton. I'll give you an example. One of the things that we did, a group of us here, is that we organized a Second Wreath Society. So what is the First Wreath? The First Wreath was a group of feminists. Well, they would have been suffragettes in Ukraine at the turn of the 19th century, in Western Ukraine specifically, who organized a huge congress called the First Wreath. And then 100 years later, we organized the Second Wreath Conference. And we were able to organize other conferences based on the Ukrainian left across the country. So in Winnipeg, in Toronto, and other places, you still had the leftovers of the group who are interested in social action. So those people stayed together, and still to this day, when I go to Toronto, I meet my old friends. They're now friends, but we used to do political action together.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so political action, if there's a good cause, we can do it.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.